The Irish philosopher George Berkeley is the next empiricist we're going to study. He's most famous for saying that no material objects exist and that all the reality of things depends upon God transmitting them into our minds. Berkeley was born in 1685 in Ireland and published most of his most famous works long before he was 30. He became famous with his essay Towards a New Theory of Vision, in which he talked about the ways in which our visual perceptions are due to the structure of our eye and the geometry of the perceptions entering our eye. The work that we're going to be reading, his treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, was published when he was 25, and it made a name for him, which caused him to befriend Jonathan Swift. And when he traveled to England, he was presented to the court and became a court favorite. As you'll be able to tell when you read him, he was a very witty and quick-minded. He also published his 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, which we're going to be reading later this week, and is a popularized version, sort of a simplified, easy version of the treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. That will become sort of a trend in modern philosophy. David Hume and Immanuel Kant will do that as well, publishing sort of popularized, simple versions of their main works. He was ordained a bishop and had devised a scheme to found a college in the Bermudas in the New World in America, and actually traveled and spent 3 years in Rhode Island waiting for the funding to come through for that university or new college. When the funding didn't come through, he returned to England but donated the books and materials to start the library of Yale College, and there are still mementos of George Berkeley in Yale University. He became famous in the latter part of his life for attacking the ideas of Sir Isaac Newton, making fun of the infinitesimal calculus for believing in the existence of infinitely small intervals called fluxions. And Berkeley argued that the truths of religion were no more silly and no more ridiculous than the truths that were believed by the foundations of mathematics. Late in his life, he also became enamored of the medicinal qualities of what's called tar water. I think it's still used in some anti-dandruff shampoos, but much of his work in the latter parts of his life were tied up with his conviction that tar water was something that could cure all of our ills. You may know Berkeley because he is the person after whom Berkeley, California is named, even though they mispronounce his name as Berkeley. It was named after Berkeley not for his philosophical works, but because of a poem that he wrote about the westward expansion of the Empire of England. Westward the course of empire takes its way, the 4 first acts already past. The 5th shall close the drama of the day, time's noblest offspring is the last. And as you can read below, it said that the founders of Berkeley recited that poem and decided that they would name Berkeley, California after him because they liked the sentiment of that poem so much. As I had mentioned, Berkeley's most famous idea is called subjective idealism, which is the belief that nothing exists but ideas. We had talked about Leibniz's objective idealism, which was the belief that everything existed as little minds or monads, but they were pre-programmed by God, and that pre-established harmony allowed them to have an objective reality because they were all different versions of the same mind, different versions of God's perception of the world. Berkeley's idealism is called subjective idealism because he believes that nothing exists but ideas in individual minds of individual subjects. His famous Latin phrase is esse is percipi. The essence of material things is or lies in their being perceived. They only exist when perceived. So this famous poem expressed his idea that material objects don't exist except in the mind, and that their objective reality depends upon God perceiving them always and projecting them into our minds. There was a young man who said God, must think it exceedingly odd if he finds that this tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. And the reply goes, Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad, and that's why the tree will continue to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. So Berkeley thinks the independent existence of objects depends upon their being perceived by God, and that all the things that we perceive in reality are really ideas in our mind that are projected into our mind by God. You can watch this little video by clicking the link over here, if you like, that explains Berkeley's essay Is Percipi. We're going to look mainly at his argument against abstract ideas today. Almost the entire book is founded upon a new way of viewing what ideas are. Just as the rationalists got more clear about the idea of a substance, the empiricists are going to try to get more clear about what exactly is meant by having an idea. And whereas Locke, we saw, had thought that there could be general ideas, like ideas that were bare, naked appearances, that were just the schematic idea of whiteness or roundness or cupness that served as indexes for our memories, our collections of memory buttons. Berkeley is going to say that ideas, if they are really just appearances in our mind, cannot possibly be abstract. His first argument says just that. He thinks that you can't imagine any idea. You can't call any perception into your mind, which isn't like a picture, which is specific and concrete in all of its details. You can't imagine a man without imagining being so tall. You can't imagine a human without it being male or female. Or you can't imagine a square without it having some color or other. So since our ideas are just pictures, visual traces of our perceptions, and of course that would include other types of ideas that come from our other senses, auditory pictures or sensory pictures or smell or taste or touch pictures. But if all ideas are pictures, and all of these pictures are really specific or concrete, they have all of the details in them, even if the details aren't very interesting, then it would follow that no ideas can possibly be abstract. Ideas are just as concrete and individual as the individual experiences that they record. The second argument is very similar, but works by saying that those properties can't be separated in reality. So you can't see color without it having some length and extent and shape. He says that you can't see a body moving and not imagine it as also having speed or slowness, or whether its path is curved or straight. So since in reality it's impossible or inconceivable that those properties could ever exist separately as distinct properties, as Plato imagined, he thinks that therefore they can't exist as ideas. I think the premise, the hidden premise here, is that anything that cannot be in reality can also not be as an idea in the mind. If it cannot exist, it can't be conceived. So the second argument says that properties can't exist on their own. They always exist bundled together into objects, and therefore it's impossible for us to think of them as ideas in the same way. So our ideas will never be separate abstract properties, but will always be the concrete, specific individuals with all of their properties combined. So those are the two basic arguments that Berkeley gives against the possibility of the existence of abstract ideas. He recognizes that our language is abstract, and sometimes we think in ways that are abstract or general. But he points out that it's the language which is abstract and not the ideas that they correspond to. A language, a piece of language, or a figure in a book, in a mathematics book, even though the idea is specific, and even though the language, of course, is a particular line on a page or some sounds, it can stand for or call to our mind a whole range of different specific ideas. So a word like dog doesn't represent a general idea or abstract idea of dogness, according to Berkeley. It just is automatically connected with a big folder of individual dog ideas or dog pictures. So whereas Locke thought that we had to actually have a general idea or schema to be the tag for our bundle of ideas, our bundle of memories, Berkeley is going to eliminate the middleman and say language can just immediately signify a whole range, or indifferently signify a whole range of specific ideas. So when I say the word triangle, you can imagine any of the various different images of triangles that you might, all of which would be specific and concrete. And when we make inferences that go from general ideas, we just have to be careful, as in mathematics, to make sure that our inference doesn't depend upon the particular features of the idea or of the language that we're using, but would follow generally for any of the ideas or cases that are signified by that figure or by that language. So when you do a proof in geometry, you may start with an isosceles triangle or a right triangle. Since you can't have a triangle without it having some specific angle, there is no general idea of a triangle. And the word triangle just indifferently signifies all the different possible triangles. But if you deduce something from your figure, whether it's an isosceles or an acute or a right triangle, and it doesn't depend, the inference that you make doesn't depend upon it having a particular angle, like being right or acute, but just depends upon general features, like the fact that it would be 180 degrees. Then the things that you prove using those features that are true of all of your examples and aren't specific to one particular example that you're using, they will follow generally from any of the class of particular ideas or particular things that are signified by that general term. So it's only language that's general, and it's only general in use and signification. It indifferently signifies a bunch of particular ideas, but the thoughts themselves are never abstract or general. They're always particular ideas. And Berkeley thinks that most of the confusions in philosophy arise from imagining that general language stands for some general idea or general object. Sometimes we call this error that Berkeley is going to warn against reification. He thinks that Plato, for example, saw that we use terms like red or dog or circle and thought that there must be not only general ideas in the mind, which are the meaning of those terms, redness or circularity or dogness, but actually went further and thought that there were actual objects in the world, the general form of redness that existed in a different reality, or the general form of dogness. Berkeley thinks that that's a linguistic error. He thinks that if you were to see that those terms were not general terms at all, but just were signs that signified indifferently many different particular ideas, then you wouldn't be led into the mistake of imagining that there were these general objects in the world of which we could have no perception and of which we can form no idea. So many contemporary philosophers trace back to Berkeley the emphasis on language. Once we get clear about the confusions in our language, we'll see that many of the problems in philosophy stem from a lack of clarity about what our language is really doing and what ideas are actually in the mind. So Berkeley, throughout the rest of the work, is going to be reminding us and urging us not to depend upon language, but to actually form clear ideas and to see that they're actually specific and concrete ideas with all of their particulars, and to avoid the belief that there are some general ideas that correspond to our general language. So Berkeley is in that same tradition as Locke, who instead of thinking the job of philosopher is to reach grand systems of truths like Spinoza's, Berkeley is going to agree with Locke that the job of philosophy is to clear out our mistakes, our misunderstandings, and in doing so, not only will we arrive at things that are more certain and more true, but we'll also see that much of our disagreement depends upon words that have no meaning or misunderstandings rather than upon real differences in our beliefs.